Hi guys, I'm Cassie.
And I'm Eric.
And we're Keto for Carbaholics.
And today we're going to be dispelling for you 5 keto myths.
First myth, fat makes you fat.
If you've been following the ketogenic diet for a while, you may have heard some people spread the rumor that fat makes you fat. And we're going to talk about why that isn't true. So when you're thinking about how fat storage is done in the body, at least in human beings, fat storage is primarily made up of stored glucose. Part of the reason is we are adapted to be able to store glucose very easily and then be able to access that later when we're at a deficit of calories and available energy as energy to be used later. So the storage in your adipose tissue is mostly triglyceride storage. And then we have glycogen in our skeletal muscles to be able to be used rapidly. And we also have some in our liver. So the calories we take in via carbohydrate are broken down very quickly and used as energy or stored. The calories we take in as protein are generally used for some of the reparative processes, and then what's left over are stored. And the calories that we take in as fat are either burned or oftentimes just excreted in our bowel movements. And it's a lot harder for human beings to store fat as fat. There is a process called lipolysis. That's the process of breaking down lipids or fat for energy. That happens more readily when you're fat adapted and using fats for energy. But just because you're putting fat through lipolysis doesn't mean you're going to store it as fat. In fact, that's often not the case in human beings. Now, in other animals where they break down fats and proteins and they convert it into a carbohydrate called glyconeogenesis, they are able to do that and store it as fat just in case they don't have calories available to them later. So this is an adaptation within the animal kingdom for animals that have to hunt for their own foods. For thousands of years, we have been a mixture of hunters, gatherers, farmers, agriculturists, and now food shoppers, right, in the grocery store. So we don't have to worry about having a caloric deficit, at least not most of us in the developed world have to worry about that. And our bodies are very adept at storing calories from carbohydrates. But because of all this time not going in and out of a fat burning mode, we don't really store fat as fat. So the rumor that fat makes you fat from a dietary fat standpoint is absolutely untrue in human beings.
So, myth 1 busted, fat does not make you fat.
Correct.
All right. Our second myth, you need carbs or energy to live a healthy life.
So you hear this one a lot. A lot of people will cite you need 20% of the glucose to go to your brain and give you energy and allow for proper brain function, or you need X amount of glucose to be able to do all your daily processes. And this, again, is absolutely untrue. Cassie actually has a degree in neuroscience and clinical psychology, and this is one of the things that she would have studied during her training, looking at how the brain actually functions and what calorie sources it uses best. So why don't you talk about that?
So your brain can actually function by using ketones. Just because your body would prefer to use glucose does not mean that it isn't able to function healthily and productively with another source of fuel. You just have to make sure that it's readily available for your body to use.
Additionally, just because it's able to use and prefers to use glucose doesn't make it the best energy source for you. That's like saying I prefer to put 83% in my gas tank rather than 93 or 85 rather than 93. You know, the 93 costs more. Of course I want to put regular gas and not super in my car. Is the super going to be better? Well, it depends on my engine, but when we're talking about ketones in the brain and in certain other tissues of the body, yes, ketones are better.
Or I prefer to get all of my food from fast food because I don't want to do dishes or cook versus actually cooking my food. They're both going to provide you with fuel, but one's going to provide you with a higher source of fuel.
A better source, cleaner burning source, longer burning source.
So your brain is able to function very well on fats and ketones. Let's look at infants, fetuses, as well as small children. Babies and children are more often than not actually in ketosis naturally. If you ever talk to a pediatrician, if you have a child, many times they'll say that your baby needs to be getting good sources of fat for proper brain development.
In fact, when they turn 1 and they start switching off of breast milk if they're breastfed or off of formula and drinking milk, what do they drink?
They tell them to drink whole fat milk because they want them to get the fats. Fat is very good for brain development. So if fat is so bad for you, why would they be pushing fat at small, defenseless children?
Exactly. Children who have these very small coronary vessels and small carotid arteries, things like that, that you'd be worried, oh my gosh, they're going to develop plaque and they're going to die. That's not the case because their bodies use it very efficiently. And we can too, but you have to be in the right metabolic state to do that.
Our next myth. This is going to be right up Eric's alley. So those of you that don't know or new to following us, Eric is actually a cardiology nurse practitioner. Yep. He practices in the state of New Hampshire, so he's an autonomous practitioner. And this myth he probably hears quite often, either from his colleagues or his patients. Keto causes heart disease.
More specifically, patients accuse fat of causing heart disease. And I think there's an important distinction to be made here. So we blame fats for heart disease simply because we find cholesterol at the source of coronary atherosclerosis. So when we're talking about that word, we're talking about buildup of cholesterol and platelet and other particle plaques within the coronary vessels. Those are the vessels that go around the heart and perfuse the heart with oxygen. So it gives it all the oxygen and nutrients it needs in order to function. The problem with blaming the cholesterol is only there because some other damage happened in the vessel causing the cholesterol to stick there. Cholesterol is the Band-Aid. That's like saying, I cut myself and I put this Band-Aid on here and now I have a scar here and it's the Band-Aid's fault. Well, no, you cut yourself and the Band-Aid was there to keep other things from getting in the open area. The other analogy I use often is the EMT analogy. So some of you might have heard this if you followed us before, but if you had a person who was shot or had a heart attack or whatever, and an EMT or a paramedic responds to the scene and they're giving the person compressions because they have no pulse and they're respirating for them because they are not breathing, and that person gets to the hospital and they're pronounced dead, you're not going to blame the EMT. Even if the EMT or paramedic or whomever tried their best but weren't doing adequate compressions or breaths or whatever, it's still not their fault that the person died because they were shot or because they had a heart attack or whatever. So you need to look at the root cause. What actually killed the person? In terms of heart disease, we need to do the same thing. Look at the root cause. The plaques are there because some damage to the vessel was done. And if it was never done, the plaques wouldn't stick there. We also only look at a piece of the picture. We look at LDL. That's the biggest thing we try to blame. And some cardiologists will look at triglycerides, which is good, and other measures as well. But LDL is just a snapshot of some of the data. And that breaks down to different particle sizes and densities, which tell us more of the story. And so we're getting incomplete information. And we have patients that have very, very, very low LDL cholesterol, but continue to have heart disease. And amongst those patients, the most common thing I see is they're either diabetic and they're poorly controlled, they're obese, they're very sedentary, they smoke, high blood sugars, they have high triglycerides. So there's these common factors I tend to see amongst all of them. If they don't smoke and they're not necessarily sedentary, then I almost always see diabetes, usually uncontrolled, and high triglycerides. And I would argue that those play a much more vital role than being told that your LDL is too high. And in fact, being told you have diabetes is like being told you've had your first heart attack. Being told you have high LDL is not considered as strong as a risk factor, but we talk about it like it is. So fat doesn't specifically cause heart disease. And when I say heart disease, I'm talking about coronary artery disease. To back up a little bit to something else Cassie was pointing out, the different fuel sources, another type of heart disease that we talk about is cardiomyopathy and congestive heart failure. That's a thickening and weakening of the heart, causing it to be unable to move as much blood as it needs to. So if you're talking about that type of heart disease, it has actually been studied that people with heart failure tend to have improvement in their heart function and reduction in heart failure symptoms when the heart is using ketones as a fuel source rather than glucose. And there's a number of hypotheses as to why that is, but that has been seen in the peer-reviewed controlled trials that have been done looking at that type of information. So that's another tissue that thrives very well, other than the brain, off of ketones rather than glucose. So just to show you, two of your most vital organs in the body don't need glucose at all to function optimally.
You kind of touched on it a little bit about how there are other factors that play into heart disease. Diabetes, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, smoking, a number of factors. Yep. And if we're looking at a ketogenic diet, if a ketogenic diet is known to reduce body mass, that's going to help with reducing obesity.
So when people's weight goes down, then they actually have a reduction in a number of the risk factors. So by reducing adipose tissue in the stomach, you actually reduce your risk for insulin resistance because the abdominal adipose tissue is the most insulin resistant tissue. You reduce vascular resistance, and so therefore you're controlling hypertension better, which can be a real problem for some people as they age because vessels naturally become less compliant. So if you can reduce vascular resistance, you improve hypertension, which is its own risk factor. It's also considered a diuretic diet, and so that reduces vascular resistance through offloading extra fluid, which also helps with our heart failure patients because fluid management is a big problem with heart failure. And so you're really checking all the boxes: triglycerides, obesity, diabetes, hypertension. And I would be hopeful that people willing to make a big commitment and lifestyle change, such as a major dietary lifestyle change, would also be committed to making other lifestyle changes like stopping smoking. So in making this impactful of a change in somebody's life, you may be correcting all of the risk factors for coronary artery disease and carotid artery disease development, therefore lowering your risk for cardiac disease, stroke, and all-cause mortality. So it really checks all the boxes.
Finally, one last point on this topic is that when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're in ketosis, you're indiscriminately burning fat.
That's right.
So that means the fat that you're consuming, the fat that you've stored, your adipose, and the fat that you generate, which is
Cholesterol. So 80% of cholesterol is actually made by the body, has nothing to do with dietary cholesterol intake. And the other 20% is affected by all lifestyle factors. That can include genetics, although that's part of the 80% as well. It can include whether you're sedentary or active. It can include things like smoking. It can include diet, but that's 20%. So I would argue that you're going to have the least impact by going low fat, and this is seen in the research, whereas if you're training your body to metabolize fats through your diet, then you're affecting that 80% as well. You're affecting what's being generated. Part of that is because you're metabolizing them, and part of it is because we see people who have higher dietary fat intake actually naturally just generate less cholesterol because the body knows that there's more freely available. And it's sort of a nice counterbalance because the intake of dietary fat doesn't translate to a direct output of serum fat, so serum cholesterol. And so you may be taking in more than you're actually putting into your serum, and therefore even further offsetting that balance in a good way. So our fourth keto myth.
Keto is a high protein, high fat, all you can eat meat and butter buffet.
We hear this all the time, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
I think people imagine us just sitting at home eating sticks of butter and just guzzling bacon grease. But keto isn't a high protein diet. Regardless of what the media says, I think there are several celebrities out there that have been quoted as saying keto is high protein.
Or high meat. Yeah.
And with the ketogenic diet, if you look at the clinical definition of it, any clinical research, any peer-reviewed studies, you'll find that keto is a moderately low protein, high fat, low carbohydrate diet.
And even if you're not looking at clinical research, so say it's not medical research you're citing, if you're looking at good nutrition science research or any research that's really being done in a controlled setting and is really looking at all the experimental criteria for good research, then you're going to see that. You're going to see it's a high fat, moderately low protein, very low carbohydrate diet. The carbohydrate recommendation for ketosis may be different depending on how they formulate the study. So it may be 50 grams of total carbohydrates or less, or it may be 20 grams of net carbohydrates or less. But those are typically the only two that fit within an actual ketogenic diet. From there, people will call it a modified ketogenic diet or things like that. We are talking about a real, well-formulated ketogenic diet. That's the other part. Well-formulated is inclusive of a calorie restriction depending on if you're trying to maintain or lose weight, as well as micronutrient requirements. So the only harm seen in any of these studies are generally due to a lack of micronutrients necessary for regular daily life.
And when it's a well-formulated diet, you would be getting in your micronutrients as well as your macronutrients, so your vitamins and minerals. I'm just going to speak to one thing you said about calorie restriction. You want to be eating calorically appropriate to your needs.
Yeah.
So when you're looking to maintain, it doesn't necessarily mean you need a caloric restriction. In fact, you don't. But you do need to eat within your energy expenditure. So if you are someone that's very sedentary, you wouldn't have the same calories as someone that's running a marathon every single day.
And I guess what I mean by caloric restriction is, you have this line that this is what I need to eat to, I don't need to go beyond it. We often put more calories into our bodies than we need. So when I say caloric restriction, I don't necessarily mean calorie deficit. Although if you're trying to lose weight, there does need to be some sort of deficit there. I will say that most of the research looking at a well-formulated ketogenic diet, they don't necessarily implement a calorie restriction, but what they do end up observing is people naturally calorie restrict themselves because fat provides better satiety than protein or carbohydrate. And so there is a built-in calorie restriction for most people, whether they enforce it or not as part of the study.
So in a well-formulated ketogenic diet, that's including a ton of leafy greens and vegetables. That's including high-fiber foods like chia seeds, flax, psyllium husk is available. You can have berries in moderation, nuts, dairy. There really is a good source of nutrition that you can have that's not just solely meat and butter. One of the reasons why it isn't a high protein diet is because too much protein can actually hinder ketosis,
Right.
in which case would defeat the purpose of a ketogenic diet.
So we'll backtrack to when I said protein can be turned into a carbohydrate through glyconeogenesis, which we observe very often in canines actually. When that is done, that's actually going to kick you out of ketosis. And people will argue with you till the cows come home that, protein is part of a ketogenic diet and you can have high protein, and I test myself and I'm still in ketosis. But when you go through glyconeogenesis, even though you may not get a huge blood sugar spike, you will get somewhat of a blood sugar spike and you will get an insulin response to that. And the mixture of those two can kick people out of ketosis. So if you're somebody who usually sits around, 0.5 to 1, you may fully get kicked out. If you're someone who sits around 1 to 2, you may get dropped down to 0.5. If you sit closer to 3 or 4 and you're trying to maintain that therapeutic level of ketosis rather than just nutritional ketosis, you may get kicked out of the therapeutic range. And for somebody who's really trying to control medical conditions such as seizure disorders, such as their diabetes, or such as the cancer trials that they've been doing, those people really need to have a more rigid approach that allows them to stay in these tight ranges of ketosis. And so it's important that the misnomers about it being an all-you-can-eat meat and butter buffet and having all this protein in your diet, it's important that that be dispelled, because otherwise people who really need to be strict on this type of dietary approach will have a very hard time doing so.
People I've worked with that are on continuous glucose monitors, when they go to have a high protein meal and they are insulin resistant, so many times they have to bolus to anticipate the spike that they're going to get from the protein. And their dietitians, their diabetes nutritionists will tell them about this. It may not be as much as if they were having a high carbohydrate meal, but it is still something they have to anticipate.
If you actually talk to a very well-trained diabetic educator or diabetic nurse, one of the things that they tell their patients, even if they're not on a low carbohydrate diet, but they'll tell them if your sugars are getting a little bit low, don't necessarily just have a carb to bring it back up because it will come crashing back down. Have a protein. And the reason they want them to have a protein is because they know it will bring up the blood sugar, but the insulin response is not nearly as significant as if you're eating a sugary food. And so you won't get that big insulin spike and then a big crash. What you'll get is you'll get a rise in your blood sugar, a subsequent moderate rise in your insulin, and then those will taper off. Well, what's nice about eating fat for your fuel source and maintaining that caloric intake through fat is you'll get a very, 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 very modest rise in blood sugar, because your body knows there's some sort of caloric source coming in. So it'll release some of the sugar stored in adipose and things like that. But you won't get the insulin spike, and things will stay very level for a much longer period of time.
Finally, to talk to the portion of keto is an all-you-can-eat fat buffet. That's not true, because again, you need to eat within your caloric needs for your body. And overeating on fat is going to offer a surplus of calories, and then maybe you're still having, your 20 grams of net carbs. But now with that surplus, your body is going to not have any need for those carbs or the excess protein. And it's going to want to store that. It may not store the fat, but it's going to store the carbs and the protein. And it might, if it needs to, it might turn those into sugars to provide the body with some glucose.
That's right. So to Cassie's point, when you're having the high fat intake, what's happening is there's this big caloric surplus. There's more calories in fat than in glucose or protein. But the fat itself is not what's going to store as fat. What the fat will do is it'll be your bioavailable energy source. And then your energy source that you're not using, your carb and your protein, even though you're only taking a small amount in, because there's so much extra calories, that small amount's not getting burnt off. And so it's getting stored. So that protein is being put through glyconeogenesis to store as a carbohydrate. The carbohydrate you're taking in is not being used up and burned off for regular energy processes. There's tons of fat available. So that stores as well. So that's a big misnomer that we hear too, is going back to our first point, the fat storage component.
Our final point and our final myth we want to talk about is keto is a fad diet. Keto is pretty far away from being a fad diet. It's been around for a very long time. It's often cited as, well, keto was used for those that had seizure disorders, and it really is not meant to be used for anything other than that, is what people kind of turn to when others will say, well, it's been around for a while. Well, only for one specific use, they'll say.
Yeah, so everything has to make its way into medicine for one use, right? Even if you're talking about medications themselves. Medications are often approved for one single use, and then they develop off-label uses. And sometimes those off-label uses become on-label uses. And so now this one medication is used for a number of things.
Wellbutrin, that's a good example. That's used for multiple different things.
Antidepressant, smoking cessation, gabapentin, we'll say. Mm-hmm. Gabapentin is an anti-seizure drug. Actually, this is a perfect example. Yep. So it's an anti-seizure drug that's also used for nerve pain. So if you've ever had shingles or know anybody who has, they might have been put on gabapentin for post-herpetic neuralgia. That was an off-label use, and it's essentially now an on-label use because it has to do with how that medication functions in the body. So the same thing goes for the ketogenic diet. Yes, it was brought into the medical community and widely popularized around 1920 as an anti-seizure diet, meaning patients, typically kids, who were trialed on at least 6 different anti-seizure medications, and despite being on those medications, still continued to have seizures, very recurrent seizures. In an effort to save any brain function that they had left, they put them on a ketogenic diet, which was shown in the vast majority of cases completely eliminate the seizure activity. So this was wonderful news, and it allowed us to see in varying populations, children, men and women, pregnant people, non-pregnant people, it allowed us to see in a number of different populations how they would respond to this type of dietary profile. And it allowed them to fine-tune it in a way where we could develop a well-formulated ketogenic diet that was inclusive of your macronutrient needs and your micronutrient needs, so that there was no deleterious effects from this type of dietary approach. And we saw that people who had diabetes, it was more well-controlled. People who were obese started to lose weight in a healthy and sustainable way. People who had mood disorders started to see fewer symptoms from those mood disorders. And people who had seizures had very, very well-controlled seizure disorders. So yes, it made its way into medicine for that reason, but now it's been studied for a varying degree of applications.
And that's important. It's been studied. There's an incredible amount of research out there on the ketogenic diet being applied to numerous different clinical practices now. We have it being researched for Alzheimer's and dementia patients now. We have it being researched for depression and anxiety. It's being utilized in oncology and using it as a supplementary...
an augmentative treatment for things like breast, brain, and lung cancer. Sorry.
It increases efficacy of standardized treatment. So they're not saying ditch your chemo, ditch your doctor, and just eat, high fat, low carb, moderately low protein. They're saying use this in conjunction with standard medicine to help improve its efficacy.
Additionally, we've had clinics like Virta Health Clinic, which Dr. Stephen Finney and Jeff Folick are the people who run and have developed that community. They actually have published 2-year data on the ketogenic diet and its impact on people with diabetes and the positive repercussions towards coronary artery disease risk.
As well as a ton of other biomarkers.
Yes. So, and most of those biomarkers do influence coronary artery disease risk. And so it's wonderful to see the data that they've obtained. But that's since 1980 they've been implementing this with their patients and have been researching it. So there's a lot of data that we can look at and pull out in different types of populations and different walks of life and see how this affects people in such a positive way.
And the Virta Health study, it was originally a 1 year. They extended it to 2. Now they've extended it to 5. So this is going to be a very long study. It's a clinical study with a control group. So there's a lot of incredible information that they're able to get from this. They're making sure that their participants are meeting with healthcare providers. They're checking them along the way. They're doing lab work. They're really monitoring these patients so we can get a lot of data from this study and be able to utilize it and maybe potentially change standard of care.
And that's what I'm hoping for. And we're starting to see that dwindle its way into different recommendations such as the ADA, but we're not there yet. So that's our 5 keto myths that we're dispelling for you today. We hope you guys got a lot out of this video presentation.
And I hope you guys like and subscribe to Keto for Carbaholics YouTube. Check out our Instagram and our Facebook page and tune in to our next video. We kick those myths, but pop, pop.